Hello to everyone that's joined so far. I see there's about 7 of you right now. As usual, we're going to give it about 5 minutes for more people to join, and then I'll kick off with a bit of an introduction. So just hang tight, and I'll be back in a second. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the fourth session of the biotech commercialization series. As usual, someone give me a thumbs up if you can hear me and see me all right. Awesome. Cool. So I think we're going to get going and let people jump on as we get through the introduction. So I think all of you have been on the commercialization series before. It looks like there's no newcomers. So you know the story, but a bit of housekeeping again. We can't hear or see you. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the public chat and we'll answer them along the way. We'll have a larger section for Q&As at the end of both of our guest speaker sessions. So if you have some bigger questions, leave them until the end. But this is our fourth session, and this concludes the second month of the commercialization series. We really do hope you guys have enjoyed it so far. We will be sending out a survey to you guys with the next month. So in the beginning of August, we're going to send out a survey to get some more feedback, some suggestions for the coming months, and see what you guys might feel is missing or how's it going from your side. And then hopefully I'll go through some of the in-person events at the end of the session as well, but hopefully we'll be able to meet more of you in person soon. So today's session is on building your venture. So we've kind of done a little bit of the soft stuff to start off with, speaking about the importance of your team, finding the right co-founder. We've spoken a little bit to the One Bio Venture Studio team about their whole journey and what they're seeing in biotech startups locally right now. We've heard from a couple of founders, which has been really interesting. And today we're going to go more into the practical stuff, the legal side. We're still hearing from founders directly, which we think is really useful, hopefully, and allows you to meet a little bit of the network that's building right here in Cape Town. So awesome. So today we'll have two guest speakers. I'm going to do a quick introduction to Adrian before he jumps on with us. But first, to look at today's session, we'll have Adrian Dommisse from Dommisse Attorneys, speaking about company formation, structuring, and legal foundations of a venture. We'll have a short break, only about 11, because I think there might be a lot of questions for Adrian. So we're going to allow for more time at the end. And then Vaughan will jump on just after 11 after the break and speak about his journey founding BioMine and the structure that they used in setting up their company. So to introduce Adrian, I'm sure you know the name, hopefully. Adrian is a venture and corporate finance lawyer working at the intersection of law, IP, and business strategy across the startup life cycle. He has experience across law firms and financial institutions in South Africa and in the UK. And Adrian founded Dommisse Attorneys in 2009, as well as the IP Incubator in 2022 and the IP Strategy Platform in 2025. He's very involved in the startup space. He advises the UCT and Stellenbosch spin-out units, led the SAVC Model Documents Initiative, and sits on the South African Startup Act movement, where he steers the committee. Clients include Get Smarter, SnapScan, Yuppie Chef, and OfferZen. So he is a popular name in the space. A little bit about what we'll cover in this first session. Adrian is going to speak about choosing the right entity type, co-founder agreements and equity, shareholder structures, etc., etc. But I'm going to hand it over to Adrian and let him take the steer. But please, like I said, pop chats as we go so that we can answer your questions throughout. And then at the end, there'll be more time for the audience to ask more questions. Adrian, thank you for joining us today.
It's a real pleasure, Hannah. Thank you for having me. It looks like my virtual background disappeared, so now you get to see all my children's gym equipment, computer games, the whole deal. I can't see how I can turn it back on again, so it's okay. It's going to be a bit real and live.
That's perfect. We love it real and live. The audience can't see us, so they just get to laugh in the background, which is great.
Okay, great.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me. Can I crack on?
Yeah, so maybe give a little bit more of an introduction. I always love to hear the introduction from the speaker themselves. If I've left anything out or butchered anything, please correct me, and then you can jump straight into it.
Thanks, Hannah. I will do. Okay, so I'm Adrian. I founded a law firm 17 years ago, which had a passion and a focus of working only with founders intending on growing great businesses out of Africa and growing globally. I came from an investment background in the UK. I worked at two large law firms in Africa, and didn't find it very motivating. What I found motivating, and what my team finds motivating, is working with founders, frankly, who have this vision and assisting in that vision. It's frankly something that we are energized about. And that we've been framing our entire skill set against for the last 17 years. We have 10 lawyers, and we work businesses through a journey in terms of which they normally face three primary transactions after having set up. So firstly, they set up in their relationship between their founders. Then they go through funding, they go through international growth, and they go through an exit. And those transactions that I described are really what we do and what we specialize in. That's kind of all we do. We don't do any litigation or property law or anything else like that. It's kind of where we focus on. And it's worked quite well for us in that sort of niche. So today what I'm going to do is take you through the criticals of why a company, what to take into account when you do set up your company. I'm going to also refer to discuss shareholder relationships. We can talk about university spin-outs a bit, given my experience there. The relevance of internationalization as to your strategy. But as I work through this, please feel free to chime in. We've got about 40 minutes left. I inevitably find the most value is when we face questions. So think of this as your greedy opportunity to ask me questions questions for a lawyer with 17 years experience, be greedy, because there's frankly nothing worse than speaking to my laptop for 40 minutes. It just doesn't really give me much inspiration. But if you ask me questions that can give me direction, then I feel like I'm kind of adding value. Otherwise, it's me sort of speaking from a script. Okay, with that, let's jump straight in. Don't see any questions yet, but that's okay. I'll give you a few more minutes. All right, so
It's early. We got to let people warm up first.
that's fine. Okay, so really starting at the absolute basics. What sort of vehicle should you start to house your company in? And really what we're going to talk about is why you would like to use a conventional South African limited liability to start with. The advent of a limited liability company, it's safe to say, changed the face of capitalism on the globe. Before you had a limited liability company, it was me setting up my business, putting money into my business, and giving it a good go. But if the business failed, I failed. Because there was no limited liability, I had unlimited liability. Therefore, if my business failed and people sued me or whatever, I would lose my house, my car, everything, start from scratch. I would be personally bankrupt. So what a company did is it created the concept of siloing a business and all the risk relating to that business into a unit being a company, and then unitized the ownership of the company by creating shares. Shares are literally that, fractions of ownership. You can have 1 million shares. Each of those is a 1/1,000,000th of the ownership of a company. It's critical because that company can raise cash. The cash raised by that company is the sole amount of risk that can be faced by that company and by the shareholders. If you as a shareholder invest R1 million into a business, that business fails, you'll lose R1 million. You won't use R1 million and R1 or in 1 cent. That's the total scope of your loss. But with that comes an important set of structures which you're going to go through. But remember, that company is fascinating, because what it allows you to do is it allows you to take and silo a lot of other things. It allows you to silo intellectual property created by the employees in that business. It allows you to silo business units, marketing opportunities. It really is not just a limited liability in terms of limiting the investor's potential loss. It also creates a silo of sort of the beautiful value that can be created in that company. Okay, so I think we had a question. Let me have a look and see. Is this sometimes the system just throws in questions?
No,
Good. Okay,
no
cool.
worries. This is Rodrigue giving us your link. I'll chime in with the questions if they pop up.
Okay, great. I'll let you chime in. So now that we've got a company, the company requires 3 roles to be very clearly differentiated in your mind, and also be very carefully framed in the company itself. Those roles are the shareholder, the director, and the employee. And I'm going to run through them individually. And the reason why I'm running through them so carefully is that you as founders, I'm assuming most of you guys are founders or potential founders actually, will probably serve all 3 roles. You'll probably be a shareholder, you'll probably be a director of the company, and you'll almost certainly be an employee as well. And because you're all 3, very often people sort of collate them into a single role. And you mustn't do that. You must really understand your 3 roles. And mostly because of the liability you face as a director. But let's start at the beginning. So as a shareholder, classically speaking, all a shareholder does is put money into the company. A shareholder, once that money is in the company, a shareholder has no further obligations to the company. For example, a shareholder can invest into competing companies. A shareholder can create a competing company. Has no obligation to the company to act in the best interest of the company. And for that reason, shareholder agreements are massively common, because it recognizes that the shareholders actually do have some relationship obligation to each other and to the company itself. But I'm going to get into shareholder agreements in a moment. I just want to illustrate and differentiate the 3 roles in the company. Now, director. This is the most fascinating concept, actually. So bear with me and indulge me here. The reason why it's so fascinating is that what a director's role is to be in the company, to build the strategy of the company. But most importantly, what they do is they run the company in interest of the shareholders who made the investment. So they are custodians of that shareholder cash, but also of the shareholder interests and rights. For that reason, directors have a very clearly and carefully structured set of legal obligations. implied by law. So as soon as you sign that form, say you're director, you are suddenly obliged to act in a way that is in the best interest of the company. Typically speaking, that means running the company in the way that maximizes the shareholders' investment, but also running the company in its interest, which means being considerate to creditors' rights and also your employees. Okay, so this is a material role. A lot of people say, oh, I'm going to be a director of a company, they pat themselves on the back, they're very happy, but that can imply a lot of personal liability if not done properly. I'll give you a few examples. If a company is running into trouble, typically speaking, it sees its cash flow dwindle, its bank account comes down, but it thinks that, oh, if I just continue business for another month or two, I think I'll work my way out of this. And the board says, great, let's do that. But the board looking at the financials know that there'll be no cash at the end of the month. Despite that, the company keeps employees on. Despite that, the company decides to keep its contractors on, knowing that it might not be able to pay those contractors, reasonably foreseeably can't pay them. It might be taking credit from creditors to buy products on credit. If the board allows the company to do that, to operate in circumstances where the board foresees that it probably won't be able to pay these bills, then the board can be personally liable to pay those bills on behalf of the company. It's that simple and that clear. There are other instances as well. If the board decides to pay a dividend to the shareholders, so it distributes some of its profit to shareholders, knowing that it can't actually fund its operating costs, the board itself can be liable to creditors in that instance as well. That's just one small example. We've got a small amount of time, but I want to hammer that principle home. Directors have a statutory duty to run the company in the best interest of shareholders, creditors, employees. So look at that very carefully. Employees, now the third role here. An employee's role in the company is simple. It's governed by your Employment Act. You have no obligations to the company outside of that act. So if you want your employees, for example, to be restrained from working from competitors or to respect your confidentiality, you've got to have that in your employment agreement. Now, these are very common. They're pretty much template agreements. But the one that skips out of that is your employees' rights to intellectual property they create independently. So if an employee creates IP in the course of their role, 9 to 5, and you can clearly track that, then normally it's pretty safe that that'll be owned by the company. But employees very often build IP independently or outside of working hours, or they might argue they do. And that creates massive potential value for the employee. That should all be swept up into the employment agreement saying anything you create, which has to do with the company's business, will be owned by the company. It sounds a bit draconian, but it is a common trap that people fall into, and the employees run out using their employment experience to build competitive products. Okay. So with that in mind, knowing that you probably have all three roles, let's talk specifically about the founder-shareholder agreement arrangement. Okay, so what we're talking about here is an agreement between shareholders that regulates the way in which they'll conduct each other, vote their shares, and operate with regard to the company. Bearing in mind, as I said in the beginning, ordinarily a shareholder pays money, gets their shares, has no further obligations to the company. Now, why would we want to regulate this relationship between shareholders? It's probably easiest to understand under 4 critical headings, which I think will crystallize what I'm talking about here. The first heading is the commitment expected from shareholders to grow the business themselves. So here I'm talking about the commitments you expect from each other as founders. So as founders, let's say you 3 founders with equal shareholding, 33 1/3 each. Normally, you don't get that shareholding so that you can disappear into the sunset and wait your value to be created by the other 2 founders. Normally what happens is you're each going to be working yourselves to the bone for the next 3 to 8 years to build material value. And you often will be doing it not at necessarily market-related salaries. The investment you're making is your efforts taken to build that company up. Now, it's critical to record this principle. The principle being that your shareholding as a founder is conditional on you still contributing to the business in some way or another, usually, most simply, as an employee. That means that if your employment stops, you're expected to not be a full shareholder anymore. This has played out many instances very negatively when people didn't have shareholders agreements. And in that instance of me being one of the 3 founders, we're all equal shareholders. After a year or so, I say, guys, building this fantastic AI bot or whatever it is wonderful. It's rewarding, but my dad's offered me a job earning lots of money in his law firm. I'm going to go there and I'm going to earn salary while you guys work your fingers to the bone and don't earn a salary. But I'm really looking forward to getting dividends in future and you guys growing the value of my shares. Goodbye. Without a shareholders agreement that says there's a consequence for me stopping being involved in the company, I can do that. So I can leave with my shares and let you guys build up the value of my shares remotely. So that's what we call dead equity. And it is a terrible red flag for a number of reasons. Firstly, it disheartens the remaining founders and employees very much. Secondly, it puts off investors almost completely. Investors see the company is immediately diluted by a non-value adding shareholder. Very easy to solve, by the way. It's one paragraph in your shareholders agreement saying that if you leave, you sell back your shares and we can agree what the value is in your shareholders agreement. But the point is, you can't keep those shares. Very often, by the way, there's a minimum period of time for you to remain in the company in order to earn all your shares. And if you stay for less than that time, then you give back your shares for less than the market value necessarily. Okay, so that's your commitment principle, probably the easiest to illustrate. The second is the control principle. So the starting point in any company is that decisions are actually made by the majority votes at 2 levels. The normal day-to-day operating decisions are made by the board of directors. A majority of directors can typically pass those sort of decisions. Then there's a tier up. These are decisions that must be made by shareholders because they affect the value of a company. And those decisions can typically be made by a majority of shareholders as well. There's a second tier, by the way, called special resolutions. And these are radical decisions. These are decisions to do things like wind up the company, put it into insolvency and so on. That can also be made by shareholders, but has to be a 75% threshold because it's so much more material. In all of those instances, the first thing to bear in mind is what is the actual controlling dynamic in your company, bearing in mind everyone's shareholding. So in our example, where we had 3 shareholders with 33% each, that means that 2 shareholders can probably pass most decisions. And if you think about it, each of us will probably be directors. So 2 out of 3 directors can probably pass most board decisions. Just basic maths, which thankfully are basic because I'm a lawyer. But very commonly and very often, we as a team get together and we agree.
I'm going to
Sorry,
chime in for the first time, just so that we
Okay,
can
great.
answer questions while it's still relevant in what you're saying.
Yeah, sure.
Stephen popped a question asking, how do you determine this market value of the aforementioned shares of a startup when these aren't publicly traded?
Yeah, excellent point, Stephen. Okay, so going back a little bit, we are saying now that somebody's going to leave the company slightly earlier, and their market value of their shares is determined so the company can buy it back. Given that you've asked the question, I think we owe a little bit more important context here. So a company starts brand new today. We as founders agree that we need to remain in the company for 4 years to retain all our shares. And practically speaking, our shares will, what they call, vest over 4 years. For purposes of today's discussion, let's assume they vest equally every month. So a fraction of 1/48th of our shares will vest every month. This means that I'm only entitled to the financial benefit of my shares if I stay for that period of time. If I leave halfway through, also just for ease of illustration, if I leave halfway through, I'm entitled to only 50% of the value of my shares. That means that the company's entitled to buy back all my shares, but only pay me fair market value for half those shares. 50%. Okay. By the way, extremely common vesting arrangement, most commonly in place with investors, but important to put in place in founders too. Now, there are a couple of instances here. One, the company's probably not going to have a lot of money to buy back shares. So the first thing is we do as lawyers for the company, we make sure the company is protected by being entitled to get those shares back immediately and pay for them in time. Just basically to give it time to finance the purchase of those shares. Because it's so important the company get back the shares that we think that's critical to do. But we also know the company needs to have a bit of time to pay it. So say extended payment terms. All right. Context is important. And the reason why it's so important, again, is that debt equity concept just ceases businesses in their tracks. They just stop being viable. Okay. Now you ask me, all right, 50% of what? Of what value? Okay, now this is common, and this is very hard actually to calculate. There are two easy answers. One, the value at which you last raised cash. In other words, these companies will probably have raised cash at a pre-money valuation. You as founders would have gone out after 9 months or a year, whatever, convince an investor that the company on a standalone basis is worth 10 million rand. The investor put in 5 million rand, and therefore the investor gets 33% of the value of the company because the post-money valuation of 15 million rand. So 5 divided by 15 equals 33. The point is there that you have a valuation of the company, and then the percentage shareholding that you're left with after the investment divided by the valuation is the potential market value there. That's quite challenging because usually the values you're talking about here for investment, venture capital investment in particular, are quite aspirational. It's usually not based on actual revenue coming in. It's based on the potential opportunity for you to tap into an economic opportunity, and the likelihood of you doing that successfully. There are ways in which to just get an auditor to come in and value it. In the context of venture capital, that's going to be almost meaningless because auditors will pretty much just look to discounting future cash flow. In other words, future profits, which is hard to understand. Okay, so I can go on forever on that one. So let me move on to the next question. Thank you. Okay, yeah. If you're bootstrapping phase, then you face this challenge. So I'll continue with it. Then what you can do is you can probably go and find an independent valuer to value on the basis of venture capital. But really, that's not actually the issue. The issue is not really whether or not the departing founder gets enough money. The issue is whether or not the company can survive the incidence of a founder departing. Because if you're bootstrapping, you haven't got a value yet, the departing founder's shares are probably not worth very much. So for them to come along and say, I want 10 million rand for my shares in a company that hasn't earned the profits, hasn't raised any money yet, that's not really appropriate, and it will 100% kill the company. So we survive, we exist to stop that death of the company happening. Any other questions, Hannah?
No, I think that's it for now. If to the audience, wait, here's a long question. So David
Okay.
asked, are most of these documents or similar examples available on your website? Do you recommend there is a minimum and maximum number of founders or initial shareholders? What are the common numbers you have seen? How would this affect the corporate structure? And then secondly, what is the maximum percentage of a founding company share that you would advise a company allow for the initial outside investors?
Yeah, great.
Maybe you want to
Couple of
tackle
questions there,
that
David.
piece by piece. Yeah.
So these documents are very commonly available. Just ask ChatGPT. If you don't want to engage a lawyer, you can find it instantly online. The question of how to treat the variables in the documents is something you'll need to do a bit more research on. Again, very, very common online resources there. We, for example, published the model standard documents for investments in South Africa. You can see the website's vcmodeldocs.co.za. I'm sure we can find a link to it just now and give it to you. VC, venture capital, modeldocs.co.za. Very complex documents, which we're very proud of launching because the complexity was being frankly messed up by most non-VC lawyers in South Africa, making deals very long to close and threatening the existence of the companies because of how long it took just to close the deals. But there's also Digital Collective Africa, which has got fantastic resources we also contributed to. Thank you, Hannah. If you would put that link up as well. Let me know if you haven't got it. I'm sure.
There we go. Yeah, I've
you.
put the VC models and Digital Collective in the chat.
Yeah. Digital Collective Africa, probably the best source of entrepreneurial legal information. We are very involved in that. Okay, then a couple other questions quickly. No minimum, maximum number of founders. Oh, sorry, I'm reading it. It's okay.
Go for
Except
it.
one founder companies are very hard to get investment in because founder burnout is a real thing. And if you lose your only important person, it's hard. What are common numbers I've seen? 2 to 7. Doesn't really affect your corporate structure, just affects the mathematics of shareholding. Percentage of founder share advisor company law financial outside investors. Okay, so maximum percentage of shares for outside investors. Trying to phrase my answer here. The reason why this is relevant, David, is at some point, if you give away too many shares too soon, it means you won't be able to do more than a certain number of funding rounds. So normally there's a seed round of 2, 3, 5 million rand. That's a seed round is really just early stage fund. You shouldn't give very much away for that, like 5, 10% if you can. Then you go through Series A, Series B, Series C. By the time you get to Series A, B, and C, you're raising more and more amounts from more and more mature investors. And one of the many things those mature investors will ask themselves is, do the founders have enough shares to remain incentivized? So, for example, after a Series A, if the founder team has less than a majority shareholding of the company, that's a red flag to shareholders. They say, well, guys, we're on a long path here. You're going to be raising funding at least 2 or 3 more times. If you already are low in your shareholding, by the time we raise all the funding, you guys are going to have like no shares. And frankly, you won't be motivated. We're not going to start that journey if we can see the end coming badly. So that's kind of the general principle in that regard. Having said that, there are a number of ways in which to raise funding without giving away shares, which basically means take money now, give shares in future. The most common is what we call the SAFE instrument, SAFE, simple agreement for future equity. There's nothing simple about it, actually. I don't know why it has that name, American. But have a look at Digital Collective Africa. They've got the template that we created for South Africa. Zoom in there, have a look at that. The principle really is that you take money now and you get a year or 2 or 3 to develop the value of the company, to prove it. And you prove it when you're doing a more formal, mature round in a couple of years' time. At that point in time, the safe investors will convert to shares, but you can kind of anticipate it. You can give discounts and caps, which means that they'll be protected to a degree. But yeah, thanks. Interesting question.
Awesome. I think that's all the questions for now. So if you can
Okay,
find
great.
your
Thank
way
you.
back to back to where your train of thought was, you can continue.
Cool. Thank you. All right. So we're speaking about shareholder agreements, why we have them. We spoke about the need to lock in commitment from each other's founders. We spoke about control. In other words, the mathematical control, 50% of the shares, 50.1% of the shares can pass most resolutions. And what we do is we add in there a list of subjects which you are specifically concerned about that can't be decided upon without your vote, regardless of your shareholding. So, for example, an investor might come in with 5% shareholding. They say, guys, this is great. I see you can pass any decision with 50.1% or 75%, depending on the nature of the resolution. But I, as an investor, don't care. Unless you get my permission, you cannot decide to, for example, liquidate this company. Or you cannot decide to convert from creating an AILM to going to online gambling. You just can't change your whole business model. That's not what I'm investing in. So those are called reserve matters. Very powerful, very useful, very exploited by investors. We've seen reserve matters of 40 different items, which is really painful. Some that might be slightly scandalous are the right to hire and fire a CEO. Is that something all investors should be participating in? Usually the majority investors, if they're, significant shareholding, but not necessarily all of them. Anyway, the point really is that we can zoom into the subjects that really you need sort of a community decision taken on. And that's really probably the most technically critical element in venture capital transactions. So phrasing the scope of control which an investor can exercise negatively or on a veto right. They won't be able to pass decisions, but they will be entitled to veto decisions if it's not in their interest or the company. Related to that, the third point for shareholders agreements, remember I said the critical elements are commitment, control. The third one is future funding. The decision to take on future funding. It's actually exactly what I was discussing a moment ago. Sort of what sort of collaborative decision making needs to be taken. But future funding in itself is dramatic, because if you take on future funding, it's going to have material consequences to the company no matter what. So no matter how you take that funding. For example, the most basic way, take out debt. If the company can't service that debt, it goes insolvent. So clearly, this is a decision that can't just be made by one shareholder. Everyone's going to say, whoa, we don't like the terms of that debt. This is a crazy interest rate. Why should we all put X amount of security in? It's a discussion. The much more common way to raise funding in early stages is by issuing shares. But if you issue shares, that means everyone else's shares proportionately reduce in size. It's called dilution. Now, that's okay if you're issuing shares at a very exciting company valuation, because even though my percentage shareholding reduces, the value of my shares has been bumped up because an investor agrees that the company is now worth 100 million rand. So I don't mind diluting. But those discussions, in other words, what value are we raising cash at, is quite important. Elon Musk is a master of this, by the way. Elon Musk maintained control of SpaceX no matter what. Plus, he set the valuation, as you know, astronomically high. So to an extent, no one really cares how much money he raised, because by setting that IPO valuation, everyone became billionaires or millionaires, billionaires, just because he sort of motivated for a really exciting valuation. Okay, last one. Shareholders agreement. So we've spoken about commitment, spoken about control, spoken about the decision to raise further funding and the consequences of the company. The last one is the exit. Most of our clients create businesses so that they can one day sell something with immense valuation and then become whatever they want. Okay. The reason why this is relevant to cover in a shareholders agreement is this. An acquirer of your company one day will frankly pay more for the company if they can acquire the whole bank sheet. So the value of a company, of 100% of the company, is worth much more than the value of 99% of the company. And this is because they just want the whole thing. They want to buy the whole thing. They want to fold it in their other businesses. They want to do whatever they want with it. They don't want to buy a company with lingering minority shareholders you're going to be irritants to. So what a drag along says is that we get together as a group of shareholders and we agree as a team that if a certain percentage of us decide to accept an exit offer, an acquisition offer, then everyone is forced to sell their shares at the same valuation. Normally, we see this number at somewhere between 50 and 75%, which says that in that instance where there were 3 founders, 33% each, if 2 of us agree to accept a purchase offer from an acquirer, the third person is forced to sell their shares at the same value. It's called a drag along, immensely useful. One of our largest exits in our history as a law firm, I think 3rd or 4th largest exit, would not have happened if not for the drag along. The investor was greedy, said, I can see that I'm going to make some money out of this, but I think I can make 10 times the amount if we postpone this exit by 2, 3, 4 years. Luckily, the company had a drag along. They were forced to sell, and it was a happy story in the end. But it's a real issue. To bear that in mind.
Do these rights to reserve matters confer just veto rights on a decision?
Thanks, Jonathan. John T. Yes, that's pretty much all they do. It just says that instead of 50.1% of the shareholders agreeing to pass a decision, you must have the additional agreement by another percentage or person. And if you don't, they can't pass it. It's not the opposite, which is what you're getting to, no doubt, is the smaller number of shareholders can't force through a decision. You always need that minimum 50%, which is also an important reason why founders must retain a material number of shares in the company, because you frankly need to control the right to initiate a decision. Even if someone else has a veto, that's very different to investors having so much in your company that they can initiate the decision. And you left to veto, because it means you don't control you don't command the fate of the company. You're not proposing it. You just respond. Okay. I'm just going through the other questions that were one or two of the questions that we faced beforehand. I think I've dealt with the shareholder split.
Awesome. Yeah, I think there was a question about, it's not in the chat, but I did see beforehand there was a question just about the kind of offshoring of IP and the timing of this. It's something that we spoke about when we did our panel discussion here. So,
Yes,
kind of,
thanks.
yeah, most commonly what you see here, I've pulled it up here actually.
Yeah, thanks.
Uh,
I was just there were two questions. One related to what happens if a founder disengages early. The other was the IP. I'm happy to go into the IP one. The
Awesome.
international
Um,
IPL.
yeah, there we go.
Okay. So the question was related to the challenges with setting up an offshore structure, specifically a US company, the exposure from a tax perspective, the cost of maintaining that structure, and so on. So let's work through this and let's give a little bit of very important context. The reason why people set up international structures is to access something they can't access in South Africa. Starting point. That can be a number of things. Most commonly, it's to access funding from investors who won't put money into a South African company. And that, by the way, that's the majority of international venture capital investors. The reason is that they know that if they put their money into a South African company, their dollars, euros, yen, whatever, gets converted instantly into rands. It's a condition of exchange controls. Any South African company that receives investment must convert that investment into rands. That places that entire investment at the risk of everything that the rand is exposed to: social, political, economic, you name it, bad news, Elon Musk having a rant, whatever it is, that can change the value of that cash and that investment quite materially. So the international investors are just not interested in that. Remember, they're choosing between you and somebody in Silicon Valley or London Shoreditch or Paris or whatever else is, Netherlands. They just don't need to have that noise going on as an additional risk item. So we set up offshore companies to allow our clients to raise that cash and restrict that risk. The other element, the other reason why we set up offshore companies is to grow our company's value outside of that same set of social, political, economic risks. And a great example of what I'm talking about here is IP developed in South Africa is worth much less than IP developed outside of South Africa. So if your IP is legitimately created in your Irish, Dutch, Delaware, whatever company, it's normally going to be seen to have greater value because it can be commercialized. It's not seen to be within the clutches of exchange control and tax and so on. Okay, so that's essentially why people do it. It fundamentally means that your company becomes valued or capable of being valued in hard currency: dollars, euros, pounds, yen, whatever. Okay, so that's the goal. Now, that goal is nice and easy to express. It's famously hard to achieve in real life because of two material things. One, exchange controls in South Africa. I'm going to get to that in a second. But by far more relevantly, the international tax code. And you'll be relieved to know I'm not going to go into the international tax code, other than to explain what it's there for. And this is fascinating. What it does is it looks at an international group and it said this group is currently paying tax in that low tax jurisdiction. But all the human beings creating the real value in the group are based in this high tax jurisdiction and they're avoiding tax there. That's not allowed. That's not right or fair. So the international tax code says no. It reallocates the whole revenue of the entire group to the company where the real value is created. Illustrate this again. I always make an example. I don't know if it's true, but it lands well. Google. Google has an Irish holding company holding some of its IP. Let's say, not true, Google, let's say that Google has 4 employees in Ireland and all they kind of do is drink Guinness, play golf, and do some marketing. But they have a subsidiary in India. The subsidiary in India is where all the exciting algorithm development happens. And the India company employs 100 PhDs. That's where all the action is. But they have an arrangement in terms of which the IP is kind of transferred to the holding company. The holding company does all the invoicing, gets all the cash, and they pay the Indian company pittance, pretty much enough to cover low salaries. In that world, the Indian government is appropriate to object and say, guys, all the revenue by Google is actually earned by our employees in India. Why aren't we getting the tax on R1 billion a second or whatever Google earns? And the International Tax Code will look at that, say, is this true? Where are the real functions of the company? Where is the real value being created? If it is India, they literally reallocate the taxation of the group to the Indian company. Now, in South Africa, in fact, in all third worlds, this is a massive challenge. It's been a challenge since colonial times. Exactly that happened. Think about all the mining value extracted out of South Africa, which wasn't really paid for in 100, 200 years ago and was recognized offshore. But that sort of old colonial style of mining, whatever, has evolved completely and is now sitting in the world of IP. And the risk is that you have teams of IP developers sitting, say, in South Africa, doing all the great stuff. And a nobody sitting in Delaware claiming ownership of all that IP and saying this is where the value lands. Exchange controls and the tax authority will look at that scenario and say, what is happening in Delaware? If Delaware is an empty shell with no employees, then the logical response is to say, sorry guys, this IP should be A, owned by the South African company, and B, taxed in South Africa. That's, in my mind, completely legitimate. The challenge comes in where exchange controls will not permit movement of assets across country. So if we wanted to set up an offshore holding company, and if we wanted to sell our IP to the offshore holding company to increase the value of the group, because IP needs to be outside of South Africa for various reasons, exchange control says no, unless you get our permission. Now, luckily, we've worked very closely with the exchange controls on the South African Startup Act Committee, and we've got parameters and conditions under which that can now happen. But it's evolving, it's still not quite simple, and it's quite a schlep. Coming back to the question is, setting up an offshore structure, it's complicated. To essentially avoid that draconian tax treatment, which every country in the world, by the way, will apply, it's not just a South African thing, of saying all your revenue will be taxed in South Africa because you're not doing anything offshore. You've got to show that you do something offshore. You've got to show that you manage the company, the board meetings. You've got to show that you have an authentic business offshore. That means real employees with real equipment, real offices. Can be an employee with a laptop and a hot desk, but the point is you need to have the real deal going on there. And then if you want your IP to be owned offshore, you've got to show that you've got IP leadership offshore too. That means somebody who's legitimately tasked with the role of conceiving and further developing your IP. You can see the full roadmap there, by the way. Sorry about another domain link at ipstrategy.co.za. It really sets out the compliant, simple roadmap for putting your IP offshore. We published that also online with the SASME Fund and the South African Venture Capital Association, just to create consistency and practice in South Africa. Okay, I think I was a very roundabout, quick lecture on international tax. See a couple other chats there, Hannah.
Yeah, there's a few more questions. One is from Jashan, but I think this is good for our second session with Vaughan. He asked, as a potential founder, how well versed should you be in these legalities right at the beginning of the process? I.e., would this be something to be studied before incorporating the company so that we can mitigate these issues in advance? Or would we just involve a professional when a problem arises? You can go ahead and answer that, though, and
Yeah.
we'll bring it up later too.
So I would simplify your job as much as possible if I were you. I would not even consider an international structure until you've proven your product market fit, minimum viable product, etc. Started to make some money. You wouldn't complicate your structure. I would avoid complicating it at all costs. The reason is there's only one winner out of complications at early stages, and it's normally the lawyer and the accountant. And our job is not to make money in your first year of life. I want to make money when you exit. I want to be your partner, and that whole journey. That's obviously what we're here for. If you overcomplicate things at the beginning, it's very challenging, and this should apply to every decision you make, whether it's your employee incentivization, the style upon which you legally structure your engagement with your clients or customers. I would strongly recommend that. And those answers, and if you go with that simple route, you can normally find answers to the simple solutions quite easily.
I'm going to hop another question following from this from Jonathan. What is your opinion on stapling agreements as a tool for creating an offshore structure?
I love them. I love the mirror company structure. For those who don't know, setting up an offshore structure you do one of two ways. You can set up an offshore company that acquires a South African company. That's an exchange-tradable transaction. It's been made much easier, but as a process, what a lot of people do is that they set up an offshore company. They duplicate the precise shareholding of the South African company. And then they sign an agreement between all the shareholders that say, you cannot have a share in one company unless you have the same number and class of shares in the other company. And you can't sell one share without selling a share in the other as well. What it does is it creates a synthetic single instrument in the two companies set off offshore. And the reason for that is mostly just because it avoids the schlep and cost of an offshore company acquiring a South African company. It avoids exchange short transactions, so on. It is almost certainly a temporary measure. The reason is when you want to build up material value in your company, an investor coming along or an acquirer coming along is not going to look on a two-company, mirror company structure very favorably. They, firstly, not going to understand it. And secondly, they're going to say, oh, complexity premium here. We have got a lot of other investment opportunities that don't have this level of complexity, and we might walk away. But as an interim phase for setting up offshore, I like it very much.
Perfect. Thanks, John T. One more from Stephen. I'll read it out, but it is a long one, so maybe you want to read it for your own context.
I'm reading it as well, yeah.
Stephen says, at the early stages of fundraising, as with seed investors, do contracts ever entail direct/private loan agreements in addition to the purchase of equity to compensate the early investors? Because if only, say, 5% equity is offered for an initial, say, 10 million Rand investment, and the entire company is effectively valued at 10 million Rand, that investor's shares are only worth 5%. Therefore, the company has to 20 times, it disappeared, 20 times simply for their return to break even.
Okay. A couple of questions in there, a couple of points that we should make. Firstly, do we ever see direct or private loans in the context of these early stage investments? Yes, we do. They are normally kind of bridge loans, which means that these are the lender knows that you're raising cash through shareholding. Then knows that it's going to be a short-term loan and will be repaid as soon as you borrow that cash, and then so you raise the cash. Normally, what actually happens is the investor themselves will lend you the cash, and then because you just need time to sort out your legals, and then we'll convert that loan into shareholding at some point in time. So a convertible loan arrangement, extremely common. You mentioned a sort of an economic scenario there. I'm not sure how I follow that, to be honest. But what you're saying really is that if an investor receives at a certain percentage, then the company's growth needs to be material to return that. Well, you're right. That's what the maths comes in. And this is the problem where you overvalue a company. And let's say brand new company, you give 5% away for 10 million Rand. That means your company's worth 200 million Rand post-money valuation. So it's got to achieve 200 million Rand just to give the investor their cash back. You're 100% right. But that's equity. The company has no obligation to repay that money ever. So that's the risk the investor takes. And there's a sucker born every day. Having said that, with the advent of AI, these valuations are being achieved all the time, because investors see a potential world in terms of which the market opportunity for the latest AI wrapper or LM or whatever it is so great that they can see that growth actually happening. There are other problems, by the way, if you overvalue a company, because if you raise your next funding round at a lower valuation, you as a founder can lose a portion of your shares. It's a complex description of what's called the anti-dilution clause in venture capital deals. Something to bear in mind. I see Gert has also given a question.
This is a bit of a regulatory question.
Okay.
If a compound is produced using a genetically modified microorganism and then purified so that no GMO cells or recombinant DNA remain in the final product, can that purified compound generally be used in human food or animal/pet food? Is the final ingredient considered a GMO, or is it regulated differently? Maybe
the answer is
not
19.
something. Okay.
Sorry, that's a deep technical question. I have no idea the answer.
You maybe want to bring that question to our regulatory session in October. We'll have some regulatory experts in this field who'll be able to answer that. And we can also direct you to Biosafety SA. We're good friends with them and they have all of these sorts of answers for you. David also asked another question. A startup has to offer some equity to early employees to compensate for lower wages and job benefit and security. Should all founders set aside equity at the start for this? Can it also include the outside investors' equity eventually, or would they insist the founders only dilute their equity? Should there be an aggressive vesting rule like 10 or 20 years for new employees?
Thanks, Hannah. This is a great
And
question. I'd love to answer it.
I'm gonna say, sorry, one last thing. Everyone else, if you do have a question, pop in your last question now, because I'll do one more after David, and then we'll go to our break.
Great,
You can
thanks.
go
That was my
ahead,
point. So
Adrian.
we close on time. This is it's off point, but critical. It's one of the very important structuring processes we go through with almost all our clients. So David makes a really good point. Startups typically can't pay market-related salaries, and even if they can, they normally need to lure away highly skilled individuals from great jobs where they have great potential income. So to do that, they are often lured with the promise of equity or actual shares in the company. Now, how do they do that? Sorry, another question came in. Good. So how do you do that? What you normally do is you say, well, let's set aside a pool of shares that we will issue to these employees. So in it's probably best illustrated in our scenario where it's getting, I'm one of 3 founders. We have 33% of this company each. We will say, conceptually, the company can issue another 10% of its shares for the purposes of incentivizing employees. That means what we're doing now, today, is we're agreeing to go down from 100%, all 3 of us, down to 99%. And we'll go down to 99% because we have issued more shares to the employees over time. Simple as that. So I'll come down from 33% to about 30%. I'm going to be diluted by 10%. I agreed to do that. Massively significant decision if you think about it, because I'm effectively agreeing to reduce my shareholding, my personal wealth in the company, to transfer that wealth indirectly to employees, because I believe it'll be better. I believe my 30%, which was 33, will be worth more if I've got very incentivized employees. Okay, so what you don't actually give your shares to anybody else. The company issues additional shares, which dilutes the existing shareholders. That was answered the first question. The second question is, can outside investors also dilute? This is a negotiation point. So you sit down with them, you say, guys, let's say in a scenario where the outside investor already has 10% and us 3 founders have 30% each. We go to them and say, we would like to incentivize our employees. We would like us all to dilute by 10% because the company's going to issue a further 10%. Would you agree? And it's usually something that they should be generally in favor of. However, unfortunately, they probably would have identified this before they invested. So they probably would have come along and say, guys, that's great. We want to invest R1 million. We want to get 10% of a company, but we want that after you guys have diluted for an employee share ownership plan. In other words, you as founders will first dilute by 10% to create the employee incentive plan, and then you'll dilute again by another 10% to take your R1 million investment. Unfortunately, that's the most common because investors will see this as they'll see the existence of an employee share incentive scheme as an indication of maturity of the company and its availability to invest. Without it, they will see and they'll come on and say, guys, all right, you don't have an ESOP. We actually need more shares than we would otherwise have required because we know that you'll have to dilute to incentivize these employees. A long discussion again, but let me move on to the last question is, should there be aggressive vesting rules like 10 or 20 years? In other words, great question here. Most vest shares given to employees invest over around about 4 years. If the employee leaves earlier, they'll give back some of their shares, they'll get value for some of the shares, etc. The reason for the 4-year period is that in the 90s, the heyday of tech boom, companies basically were founded and they exited within 4 years. They're kind of listed in 4 years. It's crazy to think that's the case. Today, in Silicon Valley, that's between 8 and 12 years. So the 4-year story is like so out of date. However, it's kind of become market practice anyway. And if you think about it, locking an employee along more for 4 years is like a 20-year vesting period. It's impossible for any human employee to even consider, and it'll almost certainly fail of its effect. Its effect, remember, it's effect to incentivize an employee because they see their personal wealth rising. and they probably won't see it with such a long aggressive period. I think I just answered Jonathan's question as well, which is ESOP versus
Yeah, I was about to say,
equity. I
awesome.
think you might have had a
So
more
that
question.
you might have what? Sorry.
I think Jonathan actually wanted to differentiate between ESOP and sweat equity. It's actually more or less the same thing.
Awesome. Jonty, give us a thumbs up if that covers what you were asking. Awesome. Thanks so much. So Adrian, if you have any kind of rounding off, I know we didn't get into half of the meat of all of this. That's the trouble with only an hour. But if you have any kind of final words, or I know you've shared a lot of links to additional resources. But yeah, any final kind of rounding off?
No, I think those resources I think the resources available to you guys are massively powerful. 17 years ago, there was nothing, legitimately nothing. Now there's 99% of what you need is available online. And the only question is whether or not you need someone with experience to guide you through that. That's becoming less and less the case, I must say. I think, have a look at Digital Collective Africa as a source of, really, and they're also really great entrepreneurial support, like One Bio. I mean, the entrepreneurial support that's available is incredible. Yeah, I think otherwise, just keep asking questions, and good luck.
Perfect. Sorry about that. I had a bit of a recording issue. So to introduce Vaughan, Vaughan is a second-time founder who believes research doesn't belong on a lab bench. It belongs in the hands of real people. He spent his career taking frontier science and turning it into things that people can actually use. Now, as CEO, he leads the strategy and fundraising, as well as commercial growth at BioMine, building across the whole stack from the live consumer gut test to a longer-term microbiome data platform. He co-founded with Diego Castillo, who was on our June month of webinars. So you have met Diego and had some background into what BioMine is doing. They went through Techstars London and runs the company out of One Bio Innovation Center. So thank you, Vaughan, for joining. Vaughan is going to talk a little bit about the structure of BioMine. He'll first give a bit of an introduction to himself and a little bit of a refresher to the company. And then he'll talk about BioMine's structure as a UK topco with a South African subsidiary and how this has unlocked funding and international growth while keeping the science rooted in Cape Town. Thanks for joining, Vaughan.
No worries. Hi, everyone. Shall I jump in, Hannah?
Go for it.
Cool. So I'm Vaughan, as you saw. Second-time founder. For those of you that were in the commercial series where my co-founder Diego was on, give you a quick overview in any case. So Diego and I founded BioMine in 2022 as a South African company, and then later structured it as an international company with our UK topco, and we can get into that as well. Now, BioMine is mainly interested in how the bacteria that live inside us influences our health. Everything from drug discovery to how we metabolize drugs differently to general gut health and well-being, and even some reproductive health as well. We have raised capital both locally and internationally, and our structure has played a role in that. So happy to share about that. Also happy to share about the more nitty-gritty stuff from a founder perspective about setting up an international structuring, the costs involved, especially legal fees that are worth considering when you guys are planning to set up your structure. Feel free to ask any questions in between that you might have. Otherwise, I'll just jump straight into telling you a bit more about our setup and the path that we took. Cool.
Go for it.
So when Diego and I founded BioMine, we set up a South African company. We got access to a grant, and we did a bit of research with that, did a lot of sample collection, created some value in the company. But when we had to do our first fundraising, one of the requirements to get the funding was to set up an international structure from the investors. We were also in agreement with this because raising biotech capital from South Africa is tough on its own. It's tough everywhere. So to get a better opportunity for access to money, we wanted to set up a topco internationally. I think Adrian also touched a bit on some of the points of why you'd want to set up where we had a look at where we would want to set it up, the geographics of it. And we were between a couple of different regions, the main ones that most people would look at. So those would be the US, we looked at the UK, Ireland was a big contender, and then even Switzerland and the Netherlands were some options we were considering. I think one of the things I can mention from that front is each geography has its own pros and cons. A lot of it has to do with tax and access to capital. In the end, we decided on going with the UK because we got into a program there that assisted us with the setup and investor support and fundraising and all of that. In hindsight, now, a few years later, I might have actually preferred to go to the US because we're currently fundraising, and a lot of the feedback we've gotten from investors on that side is that they would prefer the US company over even a European company. Right. So when it comes to the actual structuring, we had to go through it twice, which cost quite a bit of money, took a long time, and we learned a lot in the process. So the first time we set up, neither Diego nor I needed to do. So we went to lawyers, we went to authorized dealers, bankers, and got everyone's opinion. Investors gave us their perspectives, and we started going down this rabbit hole. And the process of just deciding on the structure took an incredible, for the most part, it just felt like we were middlemen. We got advice from one lawyer. We then went to the authorized dealer that had to do the application. They were like, they don't think that makes sense. So we had to go to a different lawyer, and the emails in between. And it just took. We were also under a lot of pressure because we were running out of money. We needed funding to come in. And one of the prerequisites for the money to flow was to have a topco structure set in place that was SARB approved. So we needed to make this happen as quickly as possible. The structure that we decided on when we started was a mirror structure. Adrian mentioned how a mirror structure works. It's where the shares are the same in both the top company and the subsidiary. And that was fine. We had to put all the documentation together. The one thing to consider, though, is when you have created value in the company, as we had, shares had to be purchased, and you had to get a fair market value valuation of what the shares are worth, so that the company can go and acquire those shares. Now, after a while, we got everything sorted out. We decided on the mirror structure and submitted our application to SARB through our authorized banker. And we were lucky that we got SARB approval quite quickly. I think in less than 3 months, we got approval, permission for the IP to flow to the top company, and everything in between. So that was great. Money could flow into our accounts, and that was good because we then actually needed to pay the lawyers. And of course, lawyers like to be paid on time. So got the money, we're able to pay them, and we were able to move forward. Great. Then a couple of months later, we got into an accelerator program. So that was the Techstars Accelerator program in London. And that was the first time, or that was the main time we kind of got some pushback on the structure that we did have. So when we got to the due diligence stages, the lawyers were very confused by the structure. They didn't understand how this merge structure works. We had to get lawyers on a call to explain to them that this is a normal structure, and it was quite resistant to it. But in the end, we convinced them that it's fine, and that we would probably do a restructuring of the setup to have the South African entity be a wholly owned subsidiary down the line. During our time in Techstars in London, speaking to investors on that side, we got a lot of the same sentiment that the structure is just a bit weird for them. So we made a bit of a priority to redo the structure. Adrian mentioned in his talk as well that the merge structure tends to be a more temporary solution to the structure. So we started the next process. I think perhaps before I start on the next process, on the first time that we did it, just the quick learnings is because we had so many chefs in the kitchen, that delayed a lot of time. And that's definitely something I would do differently, or would do differently in the future. But also that first structuring process with the lawyers, just the legal fees was about 80,000 Rand. So not too bad, but still a decent amount. All right. So we wanted to do the second structure. This time we didn't have as much time pressure, so we wanted to get it done right. We went to new lawyers that we trusted. And the first stage was just properly understanding the implications of the structuring of what our current structure looked like, what the options are to change to a different structure, the tax implications, the IP implications. And that's definitely something it needs to be considered properly from the start to have a good understanding um, on, on the implications. Because once you have a structure in place, it's not just a once and done. You have to do proper governance. You have to have a team on the other side. You need to have board meetings in the country where the IP does belong. Otherwise, you do get to a point where they might just say that no, the IP was not generated there, and you could have a tax nightmare. So that process took quite a lot of time. I had to pay the lawyers a lot of money for that. And eventually we decided on a new direction we wanted to go, which was having the South African entity be bought out and become a wholly owned subsidiary of the UK company. Now, obviously, within that time, research and development and stuff has happened. Operations happens in the South African company. So there's value in that company. The shares that need to be bought out needs to be bought out at fair market value that an independent auditor had to go and do the valuation for us. You need that for SARB to say that this was a fair trade. So we went through that process, got a valuation. Then we had to purchase the shares from the South Africa entity. And because there's multiple shareholders involved, investors involved, we had to buy those shares out. We had to get agreements, board resolutions. So it was a massive schlep, really, to get everything done. From that point, we got all the documentation, dealt with the bankers, the authorized dealers that would submit the application to SARB. That process took forever, but eventually submitted to SARB. SARB came back to us months later, much longer. It was about 5 months later this time. And then there was an issue with application, which was basically came down to a naming confusion in one of the documents. A simple naming thing I just wanted to get clarity on. With that process, though, just waiting for them to send feedback and then getting that feedback from our banker, having the lawyers respond, that took a lot of time. And when I say a lot of time, the second round of restructuring, we submitted our application to SARB in May of 2025. And at the end, we got approval for the new structure in June of 2026. So it took us 13 months to get that approval in place and the structure in place, which is a really long time. Thankfully, we still had a runway, but you can't necessarily trust that the process will be a quick 2 or 3 month process. It could take up to a year or sometimes even longer. Yeah, I think what else was there with that? The thing to consider is then once the structure is in place to make sure that you're doing everything correctly by the book, having your meeting minutes, making sure where the IP is being generated and where it's vested and everything in between. And then from there, I think if I had to reflect back on the key learnings, before that, probably numbers. The cost of the second round of restructuring cost us just in legal fees over 180,000. Now considering that in total to get the structuring right cost us 260 just in legal fees, that's a big sum. And because of that, I think trying to get it right the first time should be your priority. Now, I did see one person ask a question earlier about should you be an expert in this international structuring and legals before going down this path. And no, you can't do that and run a company. You don't need to do that. You just need to have the right team that you trust. So getting the right lawyers that come with a good reputation that even if they're more expensive, that you're not going to regret it later is good enough and is the worthwhile path to take. Beyond that, I would probably spend more time taking careful consideration into the geographic region that you want to set up in, because it has a lot of downstream consequences. Yeah, so I'll share how I did the second round, which was actually done Dommisse attorneys. So Adrian and his team, or one of his team members, they're really good, and I trust them a lot. I don't think he's on the call anymore, so I'm not just blowing his horn. But yeah, no, they're actually pretty decent.
Yeah, I think Adrian's dropped off now, but I was going to echo what the question was from Jashan earlier, who was asking if you should be an expert in this before you go down this journey, or if you should engage with legal professionals in the beginning. But maybe just having more conversations with founders who have done it recently and have kind of the real numbers of what it costs, and making mistakes early, what that can cost as well. So, Jashan, if you have follow-up questions about that, or you want to chat more to one of the founders that we have in our network, it could be really useful. And then also just finding out which legal teams give the best advice. One of the reasons why we invited Adrian on today is that he does a lot of work with the founders that we know. So yeah, I can definitely echo that. But continue.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, if anyone wants to pop some questions in the chat, you can start doing that now and I'll keep an eye on it. But you can go ahead.
I think also just to reflect on that, when you do start this process, you get a lot of information very quickly from a lot of people. Everyone has their opinions. And even my thoughts are based on our experiences. And I wouldn't say that two companies would have this exact same experiences. Especially if you register in different places. The US experience is a little different. Even setting up a company is different there. Setting up a company is so quick and easy. We set up a company in a day in the UK, but then everything that had to happen in between is where the real convolution happens. Yes, try to get advice, but be careful of all the advice that you do get. Try to have that single source of truth that you can follow, that you can trust implicitly, because it has a lot of downstream consequences, both financially, tax-wise, legally, and everything in between. I think if there were other things that, I would really consider the geographic element to it. I think also when we did Dommisse attorneys, first thing we did with them was a proper deconstruction of what the structures look like, what our options are, and the risks and the pros and cons and the benefits in between. Taking that time to have them explain everything properly was probably one of the best things that we could have done. When we did it the first time, it was kind of just a fuck around and find out type of thing. It was getting advice from some people and just trying to get that over the line. That different approach. Tax, spend time on that tax, understanding the tax implications, understanding what you need to do to meet the minimum requirements so that you don't have to end up in annoying situations later on. And then just try to avoid complicating it as much as possible. Make sure that when you do the structuring, you do it when you need to do it, when it's the right time.
Something small that Adrian mentioned last time we did a panel discussion with him here was a lot of people don't consider the geographical location of just where do you want to spend some time. So how much time do you and Diego spend in the UK? And did that initially have some kind of decision over where you were going to start the company?
Yeah. So I mean, so we considered a few regions. The main reasons we were between the UK, Ireland, and the US. Um, the EU has a lot of grant and soft funding opportunities. Some of the biggest biotech expense or funding and investment happens in the UK, but the US has much more capital available. So we were leaning actually closer towards Ireland initially, but there's some more complexities with setting up an Irish company where you actually need an Irish director to be part of the company from the start. Ireland might not necessarily be everyone's cup of tea. Everyone that lives there is like that's where rain is manufactured. It's dreary. It's miserable. It's not a nice place if you don't vibe well with that weather. Both Diego and I love the UK. We also really like the US. We got into that global entrepreneurship program in the UK, which was just what pushed that over the line with potential easiest path forward. And we had much more familiarity with that region. I think I might have gone back and rather done the US just because there's more investment opportunities on that side.
And how often do you guys go across to the UK now? Let's say a year.
Yeah, so we were there for a few months doing the accelerator program, and then we try to go there about once a quarter now to have the board meetings and everything.
Awesome. So I don't see any more questions in the chat. I'm going to just give a shout out to the audience. Now is your chance. Adrian had to jump off. So if you have any questions for him, you'll have to send those to our email and we'll send them across. But maybe anything else, Vaughan, that you would kind of say to prospective founders. Like you said, you mentioned that it's going to be different across different companies, obviously, and getting all of this information really early on can be quite overwhelming. So if you were in pre-BioMine Vaughan's shoes, you mentioned you would take more time to kind of get it right now and find a trusted legal team that gives the right or kind of most feasible option. But what else is there that kind of you think you would have done differently, or prospective founders now looking into it? What are some of the things you think they should be clued up on before going into this? John T also asked, how important do you think structuring is for the intended long-term exit strategy?
Yeah, of course, it's very important. Again, I think it depends a lot on the business and what you intend to do with the business. If you intend it to be a local company and you intend all your investors to be local, then there might not be reason to set up an international company, at least not initially. You can perhaps do that later on. I probably would have not done the first structuring we did at that time. I would have waited a bit more. But yeah, if you are planning to build this as a proper venture business and get funding from international players, then you definitely need to have a proper structure in place. But that's just something you have to consider with your founding team, or what the right structure is for you guys. I think that's also just something to remember with this. We tend to separate cognitively the structuring as this legal paperwork that needs to happen, but in the end, it's the people. It's about what you're comfortable with and what you want to do, how you want to live, and how you want to grow your company. I don't necessarily think there's one right or wrong path, but there are paths that unlock certain pros and might unlock certain cons. Try to be as aware of that as possible.
I know it's difficult for us to ask questions back to the audience, but if anyone, I'm curious to know if there is anyone who has set up a company or currently is. I think, John T, you might be in the middle of this process, but if anyone has or is thinking of a specific structure, if you could pop it in the chat just for my curiosity. Obviously, with this format of webinar, it's very difficult to get engagement. John T, you said, yeah, in the process of it. Awesome. Well, even at the in-person events, come and chat to us a little bit more about that and what you're currently grappling with. I would be really curious to hear about it from your perspective. Anyone else? I know, Stephen, you might have been in the early stages or considering it, if I'm correct. Pop something in the chat if that's correct. And I think, David, you also mentioned to me previously that you are in the process of it. All of our three top engagers on the commercialization series. So yeah, if you have specific questions for Vaughan, he is also at a lot of our in-person events. Otherwise, now is your time to ask your final questions. Vaughan, there is anything else that comes top of mind? I know it's a pretty simple thing to lay out what you guys have done. If you get into the like details of nitty-gritty, we could go on forever. But any final kind of considerations if you put yourself in the audience shoes?
I'm trying to think about what I didn't know before. And I think that's probably one of those paradoxes is the more you learn about this process, the less you understand about it. You might get a little bit overwhelmed, a little bit concerned. But if you get the right support, it'll be fine. I think just consider the cost of everything. Budget for that. When you guys do raise, I don't know if everyone here or if you guys have raised already for this, but this has to be considered in your budgeting as it can be quite expensive. Also, if you already have a South African entity generating intellectual property or some value, that has to be bought out if you want to set up an international structure. And that money has to come from somewhere. And if it's coming from your investors, they need to understand why it's happening and how much it's going to cost. And if money is going into that, it's not going into R&D or it's not going into marketing. So the financial side of it is really worth considering, and when the right time is to deploy that.
Awesome. So no other questions at this stage. And every time I say that, then there is one. David asked, is there any advice you can give for leapfrogging to getting international funding, as you need to get a product fit in SA first, which is expensive, and SA is the only place to get initial funding?
SA is the only place to get initial funding. If you have only an SA structure, then it does limit who might be open to investing in South Africa. That's for sure. You do get funds that are open to investing in South Africa. Leapfrogging of that, if you have good relationships, and it also depends on the size you want to raise, right? So if you're raising a large seed round, you're probably looking at like proper established venture capital. They might be much stricter on whether they want to invest into South Africa, and that can be a challenge. But if you're doing an angel round with angels from angel syndicates in the US or Europe, they might be more open and it's much more relationship focused at that point. So if the investors like what you're doing, they'll figure out a way. If they're excited about what you're building, international structuring probably won't just put them off, right? And they'll probably even try to help you figure out the best path forward. So focus on telling that story, focus on building something that people want a part of. Don't beg them to be part of your journey. If they like what you're doing, they'll probably want to beg you to be part of their journey and figure out the best way forward. I think that's probably your best way to raise capital in any case.
But the kind of whole point that we're doing these webinar sessions is because we know that there's a lot of information in the early stages. There's a lot of things that you need to absorb, a lot of people you need to speak to. And the whole point of these sessions is to start the conversation, and then hopefully you can continue these conversations at our in-person events and coming to speak to some of the founders in our network that can kind of help you through the early stages of all of this information. So if anyone has any questions, I'm going to say please send them to our email and we'll also pass them along to Vaughan or Adrian. Thank you, Vaughan, for sharing the BioMind story. And good luck with everything going forward. We really appreciate hearing it from your perspective. Now we are getting more questions. Stephen asks, does One Bio Venture Studio specifically only fund South African biotech startups, or does One Bio also facilitate setting up international structures? The One Bio Venture Studio team works really early on. BioMind is actually a portfolio company of One Bio. So maybe you can share your experience with them. I know now in the second fund, things are a little bit different. They are investing across Africa, but no, they help facilitate international structuring. They're not only investing in South African companies. Vaughan, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes. So they invest in South African companies, but the money we got from them flowed into our UK company. So they're not just limited to only deploying cash in a South African bank account, if that's the question, Stephen.
Awesome. So as I was saying, we really are just trying to give you guys the platform to come and speak to us. Vaughan, thank you so much. And also to Diego for being on one of our previous sessions. And as I said, Vaughan loves coming to all of our in-person events. So if you guys have any more questions for him about BioMind's journey, you can catch him at one of our next ones. Otherwise, thank you to everyone online today. We'll have our next session in August and we'll send some information about that soon. Check out some of the resources that we put in the chat from Adrian. There's a lot of document resources on that Digital Connect Africa IP strategy and the VC link. I'll send them out via email if you missed them in the chat. Awesome. Thank you, Vaughan. We will see you in person. I just wanted to share some of our upcoming in-person events. If you did miss it, obviously we'll share this with your email as well. We have Startup Stories tomorrow with Justin from Synexa, which is going to be a really good one. It's almost sold out, so if you do want to RSVP, today's your last chance. We have Biotech and Beers in Stellenbosch this Friday. It'll be our first Stellenbosch edition, and we're really hoping to connect Cape Town and Stellenbosch biotech ecosystems. We'll be taking a bus across from OBIC, so in Salt River in Cape Town. There'll be a bus going from here to Stellenbosch and back. If you are Cape Town based, you can join us there. And then we have planned our first Meet Your Co-Founder session, which will be on the 6th of August. And then we'll be having a few more startup stories towards the end of the year. I will send all of the RSVP links for this with the follow-up email. But that is it for today. Thank you guys for joining. We'll also be sending you a feedback survey, so please let us know how it is going from your perspective, anything you'd like us to add or anything we've missed. Otherwise, we will see you in person. Cheers, everyone.